It started as a routine afternoon at the Riverside playground, the kind where children's laughter floats on the breeze and parents chat idly from park benches. Officer Daniel Hayes had been reviewing surveillance footage at his desk when the call came in. A child was missing. 5-year-old Noah's blue sweater still lay in a crumpled heap near the swings. To most, it was just a piece of fabric. To Ranger, Daniel's German Shepherd partner, it was the start of a trail no one else could see. What happened next was a blur. Paws hitting the ground, the leash taut, Daniel matching Ranger's pace. The scent led them beyond the safety of the park, past the noise of the crowd, into a place where laughter had no place, the delivery zone behind a deserted mall. And at the end of that dim corridor, a man's grip tightened around a struggling child. This wasn't just another rescue. It was the moment Daniel realized that the case he'd been building was about to explode into something far bigger, and Ranger had just opened the first door. The glass doors of Maple Grove Center slid open with a soft hiss, letting in the warm breath of a late spring afternoon. Sunlight spilled across the polished tile floor, catching the gleam of the fresh wax and the reflection of bright storefront displays. The air carried a blend of scents that could only belong to a Saturday here. Buttery croissants from the corner bakery, the sweet cinnamon of fresh rolls cooling behind the cafe counter, and the faint tang of oranges from the produce section. Somewhere, a coffee grinder roared to life, and its rich aroma mingled with the clean, soapy scent of mopped floors. Families moved in unhurried waves through the aisles. A toddler in a stroller pointed excitedly at a carousel of helium balloons shaped like cartoon animals. A pair of teenagers, still in soccer uniforms, clutched iced drinks and laughed about a game they'd just finished. Near the entrance, a greeter handed out flyers for a weekend sale, her voice a bright, familiar sing-song. In the middle of this gentle weekend rhythm, Ethan and his mother strolled side by side toward the toy section. Ethan was 6. Small for his age, with an unruly mop of chestnut hair that caught the light when he tilted his head up at the shelves. He wore a bright blue t-shirt that brought out the warmth in his brown eyes, and his sneakers squeaked softly on the tile with every excited whisper, as though speaking too loudly might make it disappear. She followed his pointing finger and smiled. "That's the same one you saw last time, isn't it?" "Yeah, but this one's even cooler. Look, the ladder goes all the way up." Ethan reached toward the shelf but stopped short, knowing better than to grab without permission. His fingers hovered in the air, and he glanced back at her, hope written all over his face. "We'll see," she said in that careful parent tone, the one that kept possibilities alive without making promises. "Let's get the rest of our groceries first. We might come back." Ethan sighed, but it was more of a theatrical performance than genuine disappointment. He knew there was still a chance. He let go of the shelf, but his eyes lingered on the toy as they moved further down the aisle. A couple stood nearby, debating between 2 board games. Further down, a stock clerk in a green apron was unpacking a box of plush animals, arranging them in neat rows. Everything about the aisle felt ordinary, safe, the kind of place where nothing could possibly go wrong. Except, at the very end of the row, partly hidden by a tall display of discounted puzzles, a man stood motionless. He wore a green baseball cap pulled low, shadowing most of his face, and a plain beige jacket zipped up despite the warm day. His hands rested casually in his pockets, but his posture didn't match the easy weekend mood around him. He was turned slightly away from the shelves, not really looking at the toys in front of him. For a moment, Ethan's mother thought he might be waiting for someone. She glanced at Ethan, who was now crouched to examine a bin of small plastic cars, and made a mental note to stay close. A voice crackled over the store's overhead speaker, a manager announcing the start of a flash sale on bakery items, and shoppers began drifting toward the back where the cafe was located. The man in the green cap didn't move. His head tilted just slightly, as though following something down the aisle. "Ethan, come on, let's grab the milk before it's crowded," his mother said. He looked up, hesitated, eyes flicking once more to the fire truck, then got to his feet and trailed after her. She gave the man at the end of the aisle one last quick glance as they passed the cross-section leading to dairy. He still hadn't picked up a single item. Space beside her was empty. At first she thought he'd crouched down again to look at something on a lower shelf. "Ethan?" she called lightly, scanning the narrow gap between her cart and the cooler. No answer. Her eyes shifted to the end of the aisle where they'd just come from. The man in the green cap was gone. A strange stillness pressed in around her, though the store was far from quiet. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A shopping cart rattled over a rough patch of tile. The cafe blender whirred, blending fruit and ice into something sweet. Yet here, in this small square of space, the air felt heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. She stepped around the cart. "Ethan?" A little louder this time. Her voice drew the attention of a woman with a basket full of produce, who slowed as she passed, offering a polite but uncertain smile. The cart handle swayed slightly, a lazy back-and-forth motion as if it had been nudged moments ago. That tiny movement punched through the calm. Her pulse quickened. She took 3 steps toward the dairy aisle's corner, peering into the cross-section that opened toward toys. No blue t-shirt, no messy chestnut hair. "Ethan." The name carried farther this time, sharp enough to make a man restocking yogurt cups glance up. His brows drew together, sensing something different in her tone, a small fissure of alarm. She pushed the cart aside, abandoning it against the cooler, and began walking quickly back toward the toy aisle. A clerk stocking cereal paused mid-motion, box in hand, watching her scan every corner. By the time she reached the fire truck display, her heart was pounding. The shelf was exactly as before. The bright red truck still gleamed under fluorescent light, its ladder extended in a frozen arc. But the spot where Ethan had crouched earlier was empty. She pivoted in place, searching faces, scanning for flashes of blue. "Ethan." A man with a toddler on his hip stepped back to give her space. Another shopper leaned over her cart, looking down the adjoining aisle, then shook her head. Her voice cracked the next time she called his name. "Ethan." This time the sound cut through the background noise of weekend shopping. Conversations faltered. A cashier at the far end of the row looked up from her scanner. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, as the shoppers didn't hear often. But its meaning spread quickly through the air. A missing child. Employees moved with sudden purpose. 2 young clerks headed for the exits, standing guard. A manager with a walkie-talkie began directing people away from the main doors. Shoppers who had been strolling moments earlier now stood frozen, some clutching their carts like anchors. The greeter at the entrance pulled a thin chain across the automatic doors, the movement deliberate but quick. "Please remain inside," she told anyone approaching. "We've got a code at 'em. It won't be long." In the toy aisle, Ethan's mother clutched the handle of an abandoned cart for balance. Her hands trembled. She turned to a store associate. "He's 6, blue t-shirt, denim jeans, brown hair, kind of messy." Her voice caught on that last word, and she blinked hard, forcing herself to keep talking. The associate nodded and spoke into his radio, repeating the description. Her eyes darted down every connecting row. The shelves now seemed taller, the aisles narrower, as though the walls were closing in. A child's cry echoed from somewhere across the store, and her heart leapt, but it wasn't his voice. A minute ago, Maple Grove Center had been a place of Saturday ease, a patchwork of small, ordinary joys. Now it felt like a maze, each turn leading only to more uncertainty. A security guard in a dark polo appeared beside her. "Ma'am, we've locked the exits. We're checking every aisle in the stockroom. Can you stay right here for now?" She nodded numbly but couldn't stop shifting from foot to foot, her gaze flicking toward the far end of the aisle. Somewhere in her mind, she replayed the last thing Ethan had said about the fire truck, clinging to the sound of his voice as if it were a lifeline. Another announcement crackled over the intercom. "All customers, please remain where you are. We are conducting a security sweep. Thank you for your cooperation." Shoppers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering to each other. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. The once familiar music overhead had been silenced, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the occasional static from employee radios. Ethan's mother wrapped her arms around herself, the cold from the dairy section still clinging to her skin. The rocking of that abandoned cart replayed in her mind, the way it had swayed for just a moment, proof of how close she'd report he'd been signing. The words Maple Grove Center lit up in his mind like a flare. He reached for the mic. "Unit 12, Ortiz, I'm on it." From the corner of the room, a sharp, eager bark broke the stillness. Ranger, his German Shepherd partner, was already on his feet, amber eyes locked on Daniel as if he'd understood every word. "You heard that, didn't you, boy?" Daniel murmured, pushing back his chair. Ranger's tail gave a single deliberate wag, not playful but ready, always ready. They had been partners for nearly 3 years, since the day Daniel was assigned to the K9 unit. He still remembered their first call together, a lost hiker in the state park, night closing in, temperatures dropping fast. Ranger had led them straight to the man, curled under a fallen tree, shivering but alive. Since then, they'd worked narcotics busts, tracked down missing seniors, and, just last winter, pulled a stranded driver from an overturned truck on the edge of the river. But Daniel knew there was something different when it came to children. Ranger seemed to sense it, his focus sharpened, his movements purposeful, his instincts unerring. The gear-up routine was second nature, radio clipped, service belt checked, K9 harness secured. Ranger moved into position at his side without a command. The leather lead looped easily through Daniel's hand. The drive to Maple Grove took less than 10 minutes, but the silence between them felt weighty. Daniel's eyes flicked between the road and the dash clock, the seconds ticking far too fast. He glanced at Ranger in the rear compartment. The dog's posture was alert, ears pricked forward, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. As they turned into the shopping center lot, the weekend bustle was replaced by something more controlled, more rigid. 2 store employees stood at the automatic doors, preventing anyone from leaving. Inside, Daniel could already see the ripple of stillness. Customers clustered in small groups, voices low, eyes darting toward the aisles. The moment the patrol car stopped, Ranger shifted forward, muscles coiled, eyes scanning through the glass front. Daniel opened his door, the humid air spilling in, and moved quickly to the rear. The familiar metallic click of the latch freed Ranger, who stepped down with measured precision. Inside the entrance, the greeter, a woman in her 60s, her name tag read News. Ranger's claws clicked against the polished floor as they moved deeper inside. Daniel felt the subtle pull on the lead, not impatience, but awareness. The dog was already taking in the scent-laced air, filtering through the thousands of overlapping smells for the one that mattered. Halfway to the toy section, Daniel caught sight of a young woman standing near a half-abandoned shopping cart, speaking in short, clipped bursts to a store employee. Her hands moved as she spoke, fingers curling and uncurling, as though trying to grasp something just out of reach. That had to be Ethan's mother. Daniel slowed as they approached, giving her a moment to register their presence. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Ortiz, and this is Ranger. I understand your son is missing." Her eyes flicked to the dog first, surprise breaking briefly through the haze of worry. "Yes, Ethan. He was right next to me. And then—" Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together. Daniel kept his tone steady, calm. "We're going to start right away. Ranger is trained for this. Can you tell me the last place you saw him?" She pointed toward the end of the aisle, her hand trembling slightly. "By the fire truck display. He wanted to look, but I told him we had to get milk. I turned for just a second." Daniel crouched beside Ranger, giving the harness a small tap, their signal to begin paying close attention. "We're on it." Ranger's nose lowered toward the cart, toward the small items Ethan's mother had placed there, anything carrying the boy's scent. Daniel felt the familiar shift in his partner's stance, the quiet moment before the work began. And for the first time since the radio crackled in the precinct, Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen just enough to breathe. Ranger was here. Whatever trail there was, they would find it. The toy aisle felt strangely still, as if the bright packaging and cartoon faces on the boxes were holding their breath. Daniel stood at the end of it with Ethan's mother, giving her a moment to gather herself. She kept glancing toward the fire truck display, like she might see her son's small frame crouched there again if she just looked hard enough. "Ma'am," Daniel said softly, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing more attention from nearby shoppers. "I'm going to ask you a few questions." Blinked, thinking. "Yes, his action figure. It's small, about 6 inches tall, wearing a blue cape. He never goes anywhere without it." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the shelves, already imagining how that small detail could help. "And before you turned away, did you see anyone near him? Anyone paying unusual attention?" Her gaze darted toward the far end of the aisle. There was a man, green baseball cap, tan jacket. He wasn't looking at the shelves. I didn't think much of it at the time. Daniel felt the subtle tightening in his chest, a mental note to pass that description to store security. "Thank you. You've done exactly what we needed." He looked down at Ranger, who was watching the woman intently, as if already piecing together the edges of this puzzle. Daniel crouched beside the German Shepherd, unclipping a small evidence bag from his belt. Inside was a brightly colored plush toy, a small stuffed dragon with frayed wings. Ethan's mother had pulled it from her purse moments earlier, explaining it was the toy he'd been holding earlier in the week. Daniel held it out. "Here we go, partner." Ranger leaned in, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent. His breathing deepened slightly, each inhalation deliberate, methodical. Daniel had seen this countless times, the way Ranger filed the scent away, locking onto it like a compass finding true north. With the toy safely returned to its bag, Daniel straightened. "All right, let's see where this takes us." They moved toward the spot Ethan had last been seen. Daniel scanned the floor, a scatter of price tags, a faint smudge on the linoleum where a shoe might have pivoted. Ranger lowered his head, tracing invisible lines across the ground, his tail slowly beginning to stiffen with focus. Shoppers at the other end of the aisle paused to watch, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet hope. No one spoke. Even children seemed to instinctively quiet themselves. Daniel followed a step behind, reading the small changes in Ranger's body, the way his ears tilted forward, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the quicker sweep of his nose when the scent grew stronger. They reached the fire truck display. Ranger paused, sniffing at the shelf edge, then moved to the base where a scattering of dust marked the floor. He gave a short, low woof, not quite a bark, but enough for hope breaking through the fear. Ranger moved again, nose close to the floor, weaving slightly as he worked to refine the trail. Daniel felt the familiar pull on the lead, steady and sure. Somewhere in this crowded, humming store, the scent of a little boy was written in a language only Ranger could read, and Daniel trusted him to follow it. Ranger surged forward, the leather lead firm but fluid in Daniel's grip. His head was low, nose skimming just inches above the polished linoleum, inhaling in quick, precise bursts. Each breath seemed to sift the air, separating 1,000 competing scents until only one mattered, the faint, elusive trace of a boy in a blue t-shirt who had been here minutes ago. Daniel watched his partner's body like another language. The steady swish of Ranger's tail slowed, then stiffened at an angle, a sign the scent had sharpened. His gait shifted from a casual trot to a measured, deliberate pace, each paw placed as if testing the ground for clues no human eye could see. The store's hum felt muted now, the fluorescent buzz overhead drowned beneath the rhythm of Ranger's claws clicking against the floor. They passed a pyramid display of cereal boxes, their bright colors barely registering in Daniel's peripheral vision. Somewhere to their left, a baby let out a sudden wail. Ranger's ears twitched, but his focus didn't falter. They reached the aisle's end, and Ranger paused, nose sweeping side to side in tight arcs. Daniel followed the motion, scanning for anything out of place. The dog's breath deepened, his nostrils flaring slightly as if the scent trail had widened, spilling into the cross-section. "Which way, partner?" Daniel murmured. Ranger pivoted left, tail rising just a fraction, his silent signal that he'd chosen a direction. Daniel matched his pace as they moved past the refrigerated cases, the glass fogged in places from the cold within. A woman with a basket hugged the wall to make room, her eyes following them until they turned the corner. They entered a busier section of the store, and the crowd seemed to part instinctively. Shoppers stepped aside, carts pulled close to shelves, conversations fading mid-sentence. Some recognized the K9 harness, the crisp lettering that read police, and knew better than to interrupt. Others simply sensed warm, yeasty, tinged with cinnamon sugar. Daniel saw Ranger's pace hitch for a split second before he pushed on, refusing to be pulled from the thread he was following. His tail gave a single sharp flick, almost irritation, at the competing scents. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the lead, not to restrain but to stay connected. In moments like this, the bond between handler and dog wasn't just about training. It was about trust layered over time, about knowing that if Ranger was moving, there was a reason. They neared the produce section, the air now sharper with the scent of citrus and the earthy smell of stacked onions. Ranger's nose dipped lower, skimming over the faint dampness of the floor, where a misting system had recently run. His tail slowed again, tip twitching in tiny movements, a recalibration Daniel knew. Then, a shift. Ranger's head came up slightly, nostrils flaring wider. He pulled forward with renewed purpose, leading Daniel toward the back half of the section, where a narrow corridor opened toward employee areas. Daniel felt the pulse of possibility in his chest. "Good boy," he murmured, just loud enough for Ranger to hear. Behind them, the store was still, the silent crowd watching them move farther away, as if the air in their wake carried both hope and unease. The trail was leading somewhere, and Daniel knew they had to follow it, no matter where it went. Ranger slowed near the end of the produce section, nose dipping toward the floor again. His steps became shorter, more deliberate, each movement measured, as though he were tracing something fragile in the air. Daniel's eyes followed the line of the dog's lead, scanning the ground for whatever had caught his partner's attention. Then he saw it. At the base of a metal shelf, tucked halfway under the lowest lip, sat a small plastic toy truck. It was bright red, with oversized black wheels and a ladder molded in yellow, the kind of simple, sturdy toy that could survive years of play. But what struck Daniel wasn't the truck itself, it was where it sat. It wasn't in packaging, it wasn't in the toy aisle. It looked as though it had been placed there quickly, almost carelessly, as if it had fallen from a hand and been nudged out of sight. Ranger circled it once, his nose hovering just still a brighter red than the rest of the truck. He glanced toward the shelves above. Nothing around it matched. The nearest display was stacked with bottled juice. Daniel's mind was already making connections. A child could have been holding this, maybe dropped it in surprise or left it behind unwillingly. If it belonged to Ethan, it was the first tangible link they'd found since entering the store. He held the toy where Ranger could sniff. The German Shepherd leaned in, inhaled once, and then twice more, deeper. His ears tilted forward, his body angling slightly away from Daniel, as though being pulled toward something invisible. "Got it, partner?" Daniel asked quietly. Ranger's only answer was to turn sharply, lead taut, his gaze fixed toward the far corner of the section, where a gray swinging door marked employees only stood slightly ajar. Daniel straightened, tucking the truck carefully into an evidence pouch on his belt. He followed Ranger's line of sight to the door. The overhead light above it flickered faintly, casting an uneven glow on the floor in front. The low woof came again, deeper this time, vibrating through Ranger's chest. Daniel felt the shift in the air, the subtle current that told him they were closer to something important. He adjusted his grip on the lead, eyes narrowing toward that door. "Lead the way," he murmured. Ranger stepped forward, silent now, his entire body speaking the language Daniel knew by heart. They were about to cross a threshold, not just into a different part of the store, but deeper into the unknown of this search. And somewhere beyond that door, the scent they were following was growing stronger. Daniel pushed the gray swinging door with his shoulder, the hinges giving a faint groan as it opened wider. The first thing that hit him was the change in temperature, the heavy, warm air of the main store, replaced by a cooler draft that carried the faint metallic tang of storage shelving and the sharper bite of industrial cleaning supplies. Inside, the light felt different too. Gone was the bright, even wash of the sales floor's fluorescence. Here the fixtures hummed overhead in a low, steady rhythm, their glow broken by shadows that pooled between tall stacks of cardboard boxes. Ranger slipped through first, lead pulling gently as he adjusted to the new space without hesitation. His nails clicked against the concrete floor, the sound sharper now in the enclosed compressor rattling briefly before settling into a steady hum. Ranger's movements were confident, almost economical. He didn't waste time sniffing the edges of every box or lingering on the scuff marks of dollies. Instead, he moved like he was reading a map only he could see, weaving through the tight aisles with a slight sway in his shoulders, head low, tail level and steady. Daniel kept his eyes moving, scanning the side corridors between stacks. Every so often he caught a glimpse of fluorescent light ahead, or the flicker of a shadow that might have been nothing more than a swaying tag on a pallet. Still, he felt the subtle tightening in his own chest, the sense that the trail they'd been following through the store had condensed here, into this cooler, quieter place. The sound of their progress was minimal. Ranger's soft breathing, the whisper of Daniel's boots against the concrete, and the occasional distant clatter, something shifting deeper in the warehouse. It could have been a box settling, or it could have been something else. They passed a line of stacked crates labeled seasonal merchandise, a faint scent of artificial pine and cinnamon drifting from the edges. Ranger barely glanced at them, pulling instead toward a side aisle where the light dimmed slightly. Daniel noticed the floor here was cleaner, as if swept more often, fewer stray packing peanuts or scraps of tape. Ranger's pace quickened by a fraction, his nostrils flaring wider. "Yeah, I see you've got something," Daniel murmured, his voice low enough not to echo. They rounded a corner, the hum of the lights above replaced briefly by the sharper buzz of a cooler fan. Somewhere ahead, Daniel could make out the faint outline of a metal storage cabinet against the back wall. Ranger glanced back once, a quick check-in, then lowered his head again and moved forward with intent. Daniel adjusted his grip on the lead, letting the German Shepherd guide him deeper into the shadows. Whatever they were getting close to, Ranger's body language had shifted into that fine balance between patience and urgency, the kind that told Daniel they weren't far from the heart of this search. The warehouse air felt heavier now, as if holding its breath right along with them. And somewhere ahead, behind all this stacked inventory and humming light, Daniel sensed they were about to find their first real answer. Ranger stopped so abruptly that Daniel felt the lead tighten in his hand. The German Shepherd's body caught his attention. Just above the handle, smudged into the dust, was the shape of a handprint. It was small, too small to belong to any of the warehouse staff Daniel had seen. He crouched, leaning in to study it. The fingertips were faint but distinct, the heel of the palm pressed slightly deeper into the dust, as though whoever left it had been bracing themselves, maybe even pushing back against the door. Daniel's gut tightened. He glanced at Ranger, who gave a low, muffled woof, nose still working along the seam, as though he could smell the answer waiting inside. "Good find," Daniel murmured. He stood and gave the cabinet handle a try. Locked. The metal resisted with a solid click, no give at all. Daniel looked over his shoulder toward the mouth of the aisle. The warehouse felt suddenly larger, the light above buzzing faintly, the shadows between the pallets deeper now. He keyed his radio. "Ortiz to store security. I need a key to a locked metal cabinet in your back storage. Priority." A burst of static came back, followed by the voice of a guard. "Copy that. Might take a minute. Those cabinets are kept locked tight." Daniel scanned the floor nearby, half hoping for a miracle. A key dropped, a latch left unsecured. Nothing. Ranger pulled slightly at the lead, nose sliding down the edge of the cabinet to the base, sniffing with renewed focus. His tail twitched once, then stilled again. Footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the warehouse. A young stock clerk appeared, breathless from the pace. "You're looking for the cabinet key? I'm pretty sure it's kept by the break room. Manager's got the only copy." "Show me," Daniel said, already stepping forward. The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking to Ranger. Sure, it's this way." As they moved toward the front of the warehouse, Daniel kept one ear tuned to the sound of Ranger's paws behind him, the other to the low mechanical hum of the building. Somewhere in that cabinet, he felt it as much as he thought it, there could be more than just supplies. The kind of stillness he'd felt on the sales floor earlier was back now, heavier in the cooler air. Ranger stayed close, the line between them taut, ready to pull back to that cabinet the moment they had the means to open it. "Because Daniel," manager said, selecting a small brass key worn from years of use. He slid it into the lock, and the metal gave a low, reluctant click. Daniel took over from there, wrapping his fingers around the cold handle. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, and eased the door open. The smell hit him first, not unpleasant, but distinct. The faint plastic scent of packaging, mixed with the warm, lived-in smell of a child who had been here too long. Then he saw him. Ethan was huddled on the bottom shelf, knees pulled tight to his chest, his small frame half hidden in the dim interior. His face was blotchy from crying, and his brown eyes, wide and wet, darted to the sudden light. "Hey there," Daniel said softly, his voice dropping into the calm, steady tone he reserved for moments like this. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now. I'm Officer Ortiz. We've been looking for you." Ethan blinked at him, hesitant, as if deciding whether this voice could be trusted. His hands, loosely bound with a strip of gray tape, trembled slightly in his lap. Daniel crouched, moving slowly so he stayed at the boy's eye level. "I'm going to get this tape off, all right? Won't hurt. Then we'll get you back to your mom." Ranger shifted forward just enough that his head appeared in the open doorway. His ears were forward, eyes calm but watchful, as if silently telling Ethan the same thing Daniel was. "You're safe now." Something in the boy's face changed at the sight of the dog. His tight shoulders eased by a fraction, and his eyes lingered on the black and tan fur, the dark muzzle. Daniel took the opportunity. He reached gently for Ethan's wrists, peeling the tape away in slow, steady motions so as not to startle him. The adhesive released with a faint crackle, and within moments Ethan's small hands were free. "There we go," Daniel said, offering a warm smile. "Better?" Ethan gave the smallest nod. His fingers flexed, testing freedom, before he reached out almost without thinking, one hand catching Daniel's sleeve, the other brushing against Ranger's fur. "That's my partner," Daniel said, glancing toward the shepherd. "His name's Ranger. He's really good at finding people who need help." Ethan's hand stayed in Ranger's fur, and for the first time, low and steady, the body language of a protector satisfied that his person was safe. As they stepped back into the main aisle of the warehouse, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed a little less harsh, the cool air a little easier to breathe. Daniel glanced down at the boy in his arms. "We're going to see your mom now," he said. "She's been waiting for you." Ethan's head rested on Daniel's shoulder, his voice small but certain. "Okay." And with Ranger leading the way, they started back toward the door, toward light, safety, and the arms that had been aching for this reunion. The door to the main sales floor swung open with a muted thud, spilling them back into the familiar hum of Maple Grove Center. The change was immediate. The cooler air of the warehouse replaced by the warmer, layered scents of coffee, baked bread, and too many people standing still. Ethan stayed close in Daniel's arms, his head tucked into the crook of Daniel's shoulder. Ranger moved on his left, the rhythm of his gait steady, protective. Daniel was already thinking ahead, how to get Ethan back to his mother, how to secure the scene for evidence, how to log every detail while it was still fresh. But Ranger's sudden shift cut through all of that. It was subtle at first, a slight lift of the head, ears swiveling forward. Then the change in his body became unmistakable. Shoulders squared, tail stiff, weight distributed low over his paws. His eyes had locked on something. Daniel felt it in the lead before he saw it. The leather grew taut, the quiet pull of a dog who had decided something was worth his full attention. Daniel followed Ranger's line of sight across the busy floor. Standing half in shadow near the junction between the main aisle and a side corridor was a man in a store security uniform. The name patch on his shirt read Marcus Hale. He was broad-shouldered, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, too loosely. Daniel's eye caught the faint, restless twitch of fingers against one another. Marcus wasn't watching the shoppers. He wasn't scanning the exits or keeping an eye on the children clinging to their parents. He was watching them. Daniel felt Ethan shift slightly, a small sound catching in his throat, but Ranger's focus never wavered. His gaze was fixed, ears pricked so sharply they almost seemed to vibrate. A faint rumble built in his chest. The rescue was fresh, but the case wasn't over. Not yet. "Easy, partner," Daniel murmured, a quiet reassurance for the shepherd, though he didn't ask him to stand down. He needed that edge right now, that instinct tuned to a frequency Daniel couldn't reach on his own. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The movement was small, but Ranger's head tracked it instantly. His tail gave a single, slow sweep, not in greeting, but as if marking a decision in his mind. Daniel's own instincts stirred, aligning with his partner's. He'd seen plenty of people freeze in the presence of law enforcement, plenty who avoided eye contact out of nervousness alone. But this was different. This was stillness with an undertow, like a current just beneath the surface. He could feel Ranger's muscles bunched under the harness, ready to move if Daniel gave the word. Not yet, he told himself. Not until he had Ethan in safe hands. Still, Daniel made a quiet note in his mind, a marker in the timeline of this case. Ranger flagged Marcus Hale, and Ranger, still watching, seemed to know exactly why that mattered. Daniel shifted Ethan in his arms so the boy's weight rested more securely against his chest. The little one was quiet now, his head turned into Daniel's shoulder, but Daniel could feel the subtle tremor in his small frame. Ranger walked tight to his left leg, still watching Marcus Hale with that unblinking intensity. Marcus hadn't moved much since they'd stepped through the doorway from the warehouse, but as Daniel began to angle toward him, the guard's posture changed. His right shoulder dipped ever so slightly, and his left foot edged back, half behind the end cap of a display shelf. It wasn't a defensive stance, not exactly, but it was the kind of movement Daniel had learned to recognize in the field. A subtle shielding motion, a way of keeping something out of sight. And then Daniel saw it. At Marcus's feet sat a black duffel bag. It was the heavy-duty kind, reinforced seams and thick zippers, the sort of bag you could load with more weight than you'd want to carry far. The canvas bulged slightly in the middle, its shape uneven, and one of the handles was twisted as if it had been hastily set down. Marcus's left hand shifted toward it, fingers curling under the strap, a small adjustment that read more like possession than preparation. Daniel's eyes stayed on, flickered. Not wide, not startled, but a quick, calculating shift. "It's just my gear," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone trying to sound casual. "Extra uniform, some gloves, nothing important." Daniel adjusted his hold on Ethan just enough to free his right hand. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said, keeping his tone measured. "But you understand. With what just happened, I need to check. Standard procedure." Marcus's jaw worked for a moment, as if weighing the cost of arguing. His hand stayed on the strap, not pulling it away but not offering it forward either. The hesitation was telling, a pause that hung in the air just a fraction too long. Ranger's nose dipped toward the bag, his focus so precise it was as if the rest of the store had vanished for him. The faint flare of his nostrils deepened, his breathing shifting to that slower, deliberate pattern Daniel knew meant he'd found something worth locking onto. Daniel kept his gaze steady on Marcus. "I need to see what's inside," he said again, softer now, but leaving no space for misunderstanding. For another heartbeat, Marcus didn't move. Then, with a short exhale that sounded more like resignation than agreement, he bent slightly and lifted the duffel by its handles. "Fine," he said, "but it's just work stuff." Daniel reached out, resting his hand lightly on the bag before taking it. The weight told him enough, heavier than a spare shirt and gloves should be. And judging by the unyielding stillness in Ranger's body, the shepherd had already made his own judgment. Daniel set the duffel bag down on the edge of an unoccupied checkout lane, the strap still warm from Marcus Hale's grip. Ethan was now in the care of a uniformed officer standing a few paces back, the boy's small hands clutching the officer's sleeve. Ranger remained at Daniel's side, gaze fixed on the bag as though he could already see straight through the heavy canvas. The zipper's metal teeth rasped under Daniel's fingers, the sound too loud in the tense hush that had settled around them. The bag opened reluctantly, the stiff fabric resisting just enough to make the moment stretch longer than it should have. The first thing Daniel saw was the dull gray of duct tape rolls, 3 of them, stacked neatly along one side like they'd been placed with care. Their edges were slightly frayed, lips parting as though to speak before deciding against it. Daniel forced himself to keep going, his fingers brushing past the items until they caught on a stack of photographs tucked into the side pocket. The paper edges were soft from handling, some of them bent at the corners. He drew them out carefully. The top photo showed a boy no older than 10 smiling in a school portrait, the kind with a gradient blue background and a stiff, awkward pose. The next photo was a girl, maybe 8, her hair in twin braids, her eyes wide and solemn. Another boy followed, then another girl. Each face was different, but they shared a single detail that made Daniel's chest tighten: the handwritten notes on the backs. Names, dates, locations. Some dates were months old, others years. Daniel's heart sank, a heavy, cold weight settling in his gut. These weren't just random keepsakes or forgotten pictures. They were records, reminders. Behind him, the store's ambient noise had shifted, the low murmur of customers now edged with unease as word spread that something was happening near the front. 2 more officers stepped in, their eyes scanning the scene before locking onto Marcus Hale, who stood stiff, his expression unreadable. The store manager finally found his voice, though it came out in a thin, shaky thread. "Officer, what is this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He slid the photos back into their pocket, zipped the bag just enough to contain its contents, and straightened. His eyes met the manager's, then moved to the officers. "This is evidence," he said evenly, "and it stays sealed until we log it at the station." The manager nodded quickly, though his gaze kept darting to the bag as if it might open on its own. Daniel glanced down at Ranger. The shepherd's posture was still rigid, but his breathing was calm now, his job done for the moment. Daniel gave him the faintest nod, the kind that carried a silent thank you only the 2 of them understood. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The quiet curiosity from moments earlier had turned into something heavier: shock, disbelief, and the realization that whatever had happened to Ethan wasn't an isolated moment. And Daniel knew, as he secured the bag and signaled for Marcus Hale to be taken into custody, that this was no longer just a missing child case. This was the edge of something, hand, the other resting on her hip. Her expression was unreadable, but Daniel had worked with her long enough to recognize the flicker of focus in her eyes, the kind that meant she'd found something worth attention. "Got the prints back," she said, flipping the folder open and laying it on the counter between them. The top page bore a name Daniel hadn't heard in years, but one he instantly recognized from old case briefings: Caleb Vance. "Not Marcus Hale," Sophie continued, "not even close. Vance has been wanted in 3 states for child abductions going back almost a decade. 2 confirmed convictions, both overturned on procedural grounds, and a half-dozen open warrants." Daniel's jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the sheet. "And in all that time he's been hiding as mall security?" Not just hiding, Sophie said. She pulled another document from the folder, a printed timeline, lines of text highlighted in yellow. Look at his movement patterns. Every time a child went missing from a shopping center or large retail complex in the last 7 years, he was working there within weeks of the incident, sometimes before, sometimes after. Daniel traced the dates with his gaze. Cities and towns scattered across 3 states, each line like a pin in a map, and between the pins, gaps of a few months at most. Sophie tapped a spot halfway down the page. 2 years ago, Spokane. 4 months later, Boise. Then a stint in Reno. No charges stuck. Every time, the trail went cold. And now Maple Grove, Daniel said quietly. They both looked back through the glass. Vance, no longer Marcus Hale in Daniel's mind, sat with the same stillness, his cuffed hands resting on the table as if they had nowhere better to be. His gaze wandered lazily to the far wall, avoiding the mirror entirely, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the faint curl at the edge of his mouth, that made Daniel think he knew exactly who was on the other side. Sophie flipped to the next page, a grainy surveillance still of Vance entering a store through a back employee entrance, a large bag slung over his shoulder. Below it, a second still, a child's face captured mid-blink, the image slightly blurred. The caption beneath read, "Last seen." Photos in his bag match 3 of the names on the middle, in a place where he can't walk away. Sophie glanced toward the door. "Interrogation's yours if you want it, but go in knowing he's going to play for time. He's done this before. He's good at making people doubt themselves." Daniel exhaled, the air leaving him in a slow, steady stream. Let him try. He looked down at Ranger, giving the shepherd a brief, wordless signal. The dog's ears lifted, his gaze sharpening again. "Because this time," Daniel said, his voice low and certain, "he's not the one holding the cards." The interview room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the lemon disinfectant the janitorial crew used every night. Its cinder-block walls, painted a muted gray, seemed to pull the air closer, the way small spaces do when silence stretches too long. Caleb Vance sat in the metal chair with his cuffed hands resting loosely on the table, fingers intertwined. His posture was neither slouched nor rigid, somewhere in between, like a man conserving energy for a long wait. His eyes were fixed on a single spot on the tabletop, his expression unreadable. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He didn't take the seat opposite right away. Instead, he let the quiet stand between them for a beat, gauging Caleb's reaction. There was none. No shift of the eyes, no flicker of recognition. Just the steady stillness of someone who had decided the best thing to say was nothing at all. Daniel finally sat, the chair legs scraping lightly against the tile. "Caleb Vance," he began, letting the name hang in the air. "You've been hiding behind a name tag for years. That stops today." Caleb's gaze didn't rise. He kept his hands folded, his breathing slow and even. "You were in Spokane, Boise, Reno, and now Maple Grove. Every stop marked by children who vanished. Some faces we have on file, others in the photographs we found in your bag." Daniel's voice stayed even, but there was an edge beneath it. "We can put you in those locations. We can put those kids in your proximity." Nothing. Not a blink, not a twitch. Daniel leaned back, studying him. He'd seen this tactic before. The calculated silence meant to throw off the pace, to make the interviewer fill the gaps with speculation. It was the kind of game Caleb had probably played in every room like this, banking on wearing people down, Daniel said, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Name's Ranger. You've crossed paths with people like him before, I'm guessing. He's trained to find the truth you try to bury." Ranger's amber eyes stayed locked on Caleb, unblinking. His ears tipped slightly forward, the slow rhythm of his breathing filling the room in the absence of human conversation. Caleb looked back down at the table, but his fingers betrayed him now. A small tightening, the faintest shift in grip. Daniel saw it and let the silence build again, this time not as an obstacle, but as a lever. "Here's the thing," Daniel continued, his tone quieter now, almost conversational. "You can sit here all night pretending you've got nothing to say, or you can start filling in the blanks before someone else does it for you. Either way, we're not leaving." Caleb didn't look up, but Daniel could tell the man was listening. His body wasn't quite as still as before, and Ranger, steady, patient, a sentinel in fur, didn't take his eyes off him. In this room, the silence no longer belonged to Caleb. The metallic clatter of the evidence cart's wheels echoed down the hall before the knock came at the interview room door. Detective Sophie Grant stepped inside, her latex gloves faintly powdered, her expression somewhere between satisfaction and concern. "We just finished the property search," she said, glancing briefly at Caleb, who remained seated, eyes down. "You're going to want to see this." Daniel rose, meeting her just outside the doorway. Sophie kept her voice low, out of Caleb's earshot. From a small evidence bag she produced something that looked inconsequential at first. A folded scrap of thick paper, creased and worn soft at the edges. "Found it tucked inside the sole of his right shoe. Almost missed it. The insole was glued down." Daniel took the bag, holding it up to the light. The paper was no bigger than a matchbook, but the writing was tight, neat, almost mechanical. Columns of letters and numbers ran in no obvious order, broken into short groups. B17 MC, F22 JL, RO3 TP. Dozens of them. A cold line worked its way down Daniel's spine. He'd seen patterns like this before, not random but coded. Each pairing could mean something, an address block and a set of initials, or a room number and a victim. Tension now in the way he held his shoulders. He knew something had been found. Daniel stepped back into the room, the evidence bag still in hand. He didn't sit this time. Instead, he stood at the far end of the table, the bag dangling loosely between his fingers, a quiet weight in the air. "You hide a lot, Caleb," Daniel said, his tone even, "but you're not careful enough." He placed the bag on the table, sliding it just close enough for Caleb to see the contents. "These mean something to you. They're not just numbers and letters. They're a map." Caleb's eyes flickered, the first real reaction since the questioning began. It was quick, gone in a heartbeat, but Daniel caught it. The faint tightening of the jaw, the microsecond of recognition before the mask returned. "You're not going to talk, fine," Daniel continued, "but this paper's going to talk for you, and when it does, it's going to lead us to the people you've been working with." Ranger shifted beside him, a soft, low woof breaking the tension. It was as if the dog sensed the undercurrent in the room, the shift from a single suspect to something far bigger. Daniel glanced down at his partner, then back at Caleb. "You know what I hate most about people like you? You think you're invisible, but all it takes is one mistake, one slip, and the whole thing unravels." Sophie tapped lightly on the glass, signaling she had to move the evidence to processing. Daniel picked up the bag, his thumb pressing into the crinkle of the paper through the plastic. It felt like holding a fuse, small, fragile, but capable of setting off something far larger than the room they were standing in. As he stepped out into the hallway, he couldn't shake the thought gnawing at the back of his mind. If this really is a network, Ethan might just be one of many, and somewhere, out there, other names on that paper might still have time, or they might already be gone. The precinct was quieter than usual for late afternoon, the kind of stillness that made the ticking wall clock sound unnaturally loud. Daniel sat hunched over his desk, the overhead fluorescent light turning the edges of the paper in front of him a pale yellow. The small note from Caleb's shoe, now removed from its evidence bag, lay unfolded beside a large county map spread corner to corner over the desk's surface. A mug of coffee, gone cold hours ago, fell within walking distance of local elementary schools. Another two were near small public parks, places where kids would play, unsupervised for stretches of time. Ranger lay at Daniel's feet, head resting on his front paws, amber eyes flicking up every so often, as if tracking the tension in his handler's posture. Once, Daniel caught the faint twitch of the dog's nose when his hand brushed across a particular section of the map, the area near Rivergate Mall, where they'd rescued Ethan just a day earlier. Daniel froze, looking down at him. "You remember that scent, don't you, boy?" Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, and gave a low breath through his nostrils. Not quite a bark, but not nothing. His gaze lingered on that spot of the map, the corner of 4th and Willow. Daniel marked it with a red pen. "Me too." The more he worked, the clearer the picture became. These weren't random dots scattered across the county. They formed an arc, a chain that stretched from the east side's old rail yard all the way to the riverfront warehouses. The pattern wasn't perfect, but it had rhythm, almost like a circuit someone could walk or drive in a day. Daniel leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd worked cases involving trafficking before, but this was more methodical. Every location could serve as a pickup or drop-off point. Parks for luring, malls for blending in, schools for scouting, and each set of initials, that was the part that twisted his gut the hardest, could be a name, a child's name. He pulled a notepad closer, writing them in a neat column. Some pairs meant nothing to him yet, just letters in the dark. But others, MC, could it be Maria Cole, the girl who went missing from Lincoln Elementary last year? TP, Tyler Parker, last seen riding his bike near Crestwood Park 2 summers ago. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the overlap was there, too much to ignore. Ranger shifted again, this time sitting up fully, his gaze steady on Daniel's hand as he tapped the map. Daniel gave him a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're on to something, partner." He pulled his chair closer and drew a faint pencil line connecting the dots in sequence. It wasn't a straight route. Whoever planned this had been careful to avoid a child who's still unaccounted for. Daniel's eyes dropped to the map again, to the dots that had begun to feel heavier than ink. "That's what I was afraid of." "We need to get a task force on this," Sophie said. "If Caleb was just one piece, the others could still be active. And if they know he's in custody, they'll scatter," Daniel finished. He glanced down at Ranger, who was now standing, muscles taut, as if he could sense the urgency. Daniel reached for his jacket, folding the map carefully but keeping the coded note in his pocket. "Let's move before they get the chance." As he headed for the door, Ranger at his side, Daniel caught one last look at the map spread across his desk. The red dots seemed to burn against the paper, each one a reminder that this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The evidence board in the small conference room was already cluttered with printouts, photographs, and sticky notes. Daniel stood with his arms folded, eyes scanning the coded note and the red-circled addresses now blown up on a wall map. Sophie sat at the edge of the table, elbows on her knees, her face tight with thought. She had been quiet for the last few minutes, staring at one specific address Daniel had just marked, Green Hollow Park. It sat near the center of the map, a small public space that most people in the county passed by without much notice. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of memory. 3 years ago, we had a case there. Daniel looked over. Green Hollow? She nodded slowly. A little boy, age 8, name was Aaron Mitchell, went missing during a Saturday picnic with his parents. They were setting up a grill, and he was playing by the swings. Witnesses said they saw him chasing a red kite toward the tree line. He never came back. Daniel straightened, the words hooking deep. I remember reading something about that. The search went on for weeks. Yeah, Sophie said, the faint rasp in her tone betraying more than just professional detachment. We combed every inch of that park. Ground teams, drones, dogs. Nothing. No trace. It went cold, and without new leads, the file ended up in storage. She exhaled, eyes still fixed on the circled dot. But now, that's one of the addresses for a muted thud. The top file photo was a faded image of Aaron, brown hair, crooked smile, a gap where his 2 front teeth should have been. Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest. Sophie flipped through the contents, Incident reports, search grid maps, interviews. Here, she tapped a witness statement. A park maintenance worker reported seeing a dark SUV parked in the service lot that day. Said it didn't belong to any staff. No plates recorded, no follow-up. It was brushed off as unrelated. Daniel's brow furrowed. That's a detail we can't ignore now. Where there's a pattern, there's a plan. He thought of the other addresses, the way they looped through familiar public spaces. If Green Hollow was an early site, then this group's been refining their methods for years. Aaron could have been one of their first victims. Sophie didn't speak for a moment, just closed the file and pressed her palm against it, as though keeping it from slipping away. If that's true, then the list in Caleb's shoe isn't just where they've been. It's where they plan to go again. Daniel leaned on the table, scanning the red-marked points on the map like they were a trail of embers still glowing in the dark. And now we've got to figure out how many of those embers are still burning. He turned to Sophie. Pull everything we've got on Green Hollow. CCTV from nearby businesses, old traffic cams, anything archived. If the same vehicles show up in other locations on this list, we've got a thread to pull. Sophie gave a small nod, already reaching for her laptop. And if I can get plate numbers, I can cross-reference them with known associates from Caleb's background. Daniel looked down at Ranger, who was now standing, tail still, head slightly lowered like a soldier awaiting orders. You ready to dig deeper, partner? Ranger's quiet woof was answer enough. The weight of Sophie's discovery lingered in the air. It wasn't just another clue. It was a bridge to a past failure, a reminder that some of the faces on missing posters might still be out there, or might never be found. And if Caleb's list was any indication, the clock on the next disappearance had already started ticking. Daniel straightened, his voice low but certain. We're not letting this go cold again. The captain back in his chair. Tell me what you've got. Daniel stepped forward, laying the folded county map and Caleb's coded note on the desk. The edges of the paper were already worn from handling. Sophie stood beside him, a silent pillar, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Daniel didn't waste time. The note we found in Caleb's shoe isn't random. The addresses match locations of past disappearances, cold cases, and they're all public areas, parks, schools, shopping centers. At least one of these sites, Green Hollow Park, connects to a 3-year-old abduction that was never solved. Harris's gaze moved between Daniel and Sophie, measuring the weight of their words. And you think this is part of a coordinated operation? I don't think, Daniel said quietly. I know. The timing, the locations, the method. It's patterned. Caleb wasn't acting alone. This is a network. Sophie slid a photo from the cold case file across the desk. A smiling boy with a missing tooth. Aaron Mitchell, 8 years old. Green Hollow was the start, but I think they've been refining their process since then. This list, she tapped the note, might be their next moves. The captain's jaw tightened. And we don't know how soon they'll strike again. No, sir, Daniel said, which is why we need to act now. We form a small task force, people we trust completely, and we put eyes on every location in that note. Surveillance teams, plainclothes officers, canine units where possible. We don't approach unless we see movement that matches their pattern. Harris rubbed a hand over his face, then leaned forward, elbows on the desk. How many addresses? 12, Daniel replied, spread over the county. We can't cover all of them around the clock with the manpower we have, but if we split shifts and coordinate with nearby precincts, we can at least keep a rolling watch. And your trigger? Harris asked. Daniel nodded toward the note. Any sign of the same vehicles spotted in past cases, SUVs, unmarked vans, or individuals matching descriptions from Caleb's background. We log it, we follow, and if there's a grab attempt, we intervene immediately. The captain studied him for a moment, then reached for his phone. All right, you'll have it. I'll handpick the team myself. We keep this quiet until we have something solid. Last thing we need is the media connected by faint lines. Photos from cold cases were clipped along the edges, each face a reminder of what was at stake. Daniel took the lead, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "We believe Caleb Vance is part of a coordinated group targeting children in public spaces. This list is our best lead, 12 potential sites. Some of these match cold cases. We don't know the timeline, but based on his behavior and past patterns, we're assuming they're already in motion." He outlined the plan: rotating watches, marked and unmarked vehicles, cross-checking sightings in real time. "You'll each be assigned 2 sites. Maintain a low profile. The goal isn't to scare them off, it's to catch them in the act, tie them to multiple locations, and shut this network down." Someone in the back asked, "And if we spot a suspect?" "Document everything. Call it in. If a child is in immediate danger, you act, but you act smart. No hero moves that blow the bigger operation." Harris added, "This doesn't leave this room. No leaks, no chatter. We're working against people who are organized and careful. If they know we're watching, they'll vanish." Daniel looked at each face in the room. Every one of those red marks on the map represents someone's child, someone's brother or sister. We don't get to let another one slip away. At his feet, Ranger sat alert, amber eyes sweeping the room as if he understood the gravity of the moment. His presence was a silent anchor, a reminder that instincts and resolve often made the difference between being too late and being right on time. As the meeting broke into smaller groups to discuss assignments, Daniel stepped back, letting the hum of planning fill the room. Outside, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The first night of surveillance would start in less than 2 hours. They were moving, finally. And if Daniel had anything to say about it, the next time Caleb's network tried to make a move, they'd find themselves walking straight into the hands of the people who had been waiting for them all along. The conference room still smelled faintly of dry erase markers and burnt coffee when the call came through. Daniel had just finished assigning the last surveillance rotation, the map on the wall still bristling with pushpins and red thread lines, when the dispatcher's voice cracked through the radio on his belt. Turned toward the room, eyes locking with Captain Harris. "We're on it," Harris said simply, reading the situation without the need for details. Ranger was already on his feet, hackles faintly raised, tail rigid with anticipation. His ears swiveled toward Daniel, eyes locked as if to say, "Let's move." Daniel grabbed his jacket and the folder from the table without looking down, knowing Ranger would be right at his side. The hallway blurred as they moved. Daniel barely registered Sophie calling after him, something about keeping her updated, as he pushed through the precinct doors into the sharp chill of late afternoon. By the time he slid into the driver's seat, Ranger had already leapt into the back, pacing once before sitting at attention. Daniel hit the siren and peeled away from the curb, the sound slicing through the traffic ahead. "Dispatch, confirm last location," Daniel said into the radio, weaving through a line of slow-moving cars. "North Playground, adjacent to Lot C, Riverside Commons," the dispatcher replied. "Mother reports she looked away for less than 30 seconds. Child was gone when she turned back. Witness saw a man leading a child toward the west parking area, but lost sight near the food court entrance." Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. West parking area, that was exactly where one of the addresses on Caleb's note had been marked. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. "They're moving early." The drive stretched in his mind, though the dashboard clock insisted it had been only 4 minutes. The shopping center came into view, a sprawl of glass and brick with holiday banners flapping in the wind. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the flashing lights of the first patrol car that had arrived, its officer trying to corral a small group of distraught adults near the playground fence. He pulled into the curb, killing the siren but leaving the engine running. Ranger was out the door before Daniel could fully unclip the back latch, his paws hitting the pavement with purpose. The scene was chaotic. A woman in a pale green coat, Noah's mother, Daniel guessed, was clutching her phone in one hand, her voice breaking as she tried to answer a patrol officer's questions. A cluster of parents hovered nearby, scanning the area as if the boy might simply reappear if they looked hard enough. Daniel approached quickly, badge in hand. "I'm Detective Daniel Reed. "This is Ranger. Jacket, blue jeans, white sneakers," she said, wiping her eyes. He has a little Spider-Man patch on the sleeve, and—" She glanced toward Ranger, a flicker of hope in her expression. "He likes dogs. He'd go right up to one if he saw it." Daniel nodded, filing that away. He turned to Ranger, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Find Noah." Ranger's nose went to the ground immediately, weaving in small arcs around the base of the slide, the mulch crunching under his paws. He moved toward the edge of the playground, past the swings, and stopped abruptly at the opening in the fence that led toward the west parking lot. Daniel followed, motioning for the nearest patrol officer. "Get a perimeter on the west lot now. No one in or out without clearance." Ranger lowered his head again, nostrils flaring. Daniel could almost see the moment he picked up a stronger thread. His pace quickened, body low, tail rigid. He followed it across a stretch of sidewalk toward the service corridor between the food court and a department store. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of fried food and car exhaust, but Ranger stayed locked in, pulling Daniel along with silent urgency. Somewhere ahead, the muffled thud of footsteps echoed off the brick walls. Daniel's radio crackled. "Reed, this is Unit 5. We've got a possible visual. A male, dark hoodie, carrying something small, moving toward the south exit of the food court." Daniel's stomach knotted. "Hold position. Do not engage until I confirm." He broke into a jog, Ranger matching his stride effortlessly. As they reached the corner of the corridor, Daniel caught a glimpse. A man's back, moving quickly, the faint flash of red fabric tucked under one arm. Ranger let out a sharp, low bark. Daniel keyed the radio again, voice firm. "This is Unit 7. Suspect in sight. Moving to intercept." The wind cut sharper in the open space beyond the playground fence, carrying with it the mingled scents of asphalt, exhaust, and something fainter, something Ranger's body recognized before Daniel's mind could. An officer jogged up, holding a small, crumpled bundle of red fabric. "Detective Reed, found this near the swings. Spider-Man patch on the sleeve." Daniel's jaw tightened. Noah's sweater. He crouched, the day's fading warmth. But Ranger kept low, nose sweeping left and right, tail rigid. He slowed at a silver sedan, sniffed the air near the door handle, then pressed forward toward the far edge where a narrow lane fed into the mall's delivery area. Daniel keyed his radio. "Unit 7 to all units, possible trail heading toward the rear service zone. I need Units 9 and 12 to cover the south and east exits now." "Copy that," a voice replied, crackling over the line. The parking lot gave way to a cracked stretch of service road, its edges cluttered with dumpsters, stacked pallets, and the stale smell of cooking oil. Fluorescent lights hummed above a loading dock in the distance, casting pools of sickly yellow across the concrete. Ranger stopped abruptly, ears swiveling forward. He sniffed the air, then veered hard left toward the shadowed gap between two delivery bays. Daniel's pulse spiked. This was a choke point, the kind you didn't stumble into by accident. "Ranger, easy," he murmured, scanning the shadows. The faint metallic clang of a closing door echoed ahead, followed by the squeak of hurried footsteps on wet pavement. Daniel advanced, hand resting near the holster at his hip, the other holding the leash just loose enough for Ranger to guide. The dog's pace increased, body low, head pulling forward in sharp, sure motions. He wasn't just following a scent anymore, he was tracking with intent. The delivery zone opened into a wider space, littered with abandoned shopping carts and broken-down cardboard. The air here was cooler, carrying a faint tang of chemical cleaner mixed with something more acrid, gasoline maybe, or old paint. Halfway across the lot, Ranger stopped again, nose pressed to a damp patch on the ground. Daniel crouched beside him, touching the spot. It was wet, but not from rain. His fingers came away smelling faintly of cheap cologne, the kind you'd remember if you'd smelled it once before. Daniel's mind flashed back to the security logs from Caleb's file. Two prior incidents mentioned a chemical-tinged scent witnesses noticed after abductions. "Same M.O.," he muttered. Ranger gave a low whine, then pulled toward the rear corner where a chain-link gate hung partially open. Beyond it, the alley stretched toward the loading docks of 3 different stores. This was a perfect escape route, and the muffled shuffle of movement. Someone was close. Ranger stopped just before the turn, his body rigid, head angled toward the sound. Daniel stepped up beside him, peering around the corner. A large green dumpster blocked part of the path, but beyond it a figure in a dark hoodie was crouched near a service door, one hand fumbling with something at the lock. The red of Noah's jacket sleeve was barely visible, peeking from under the man's arm. Daniel's heart hammered. They were within 30 feet. The suspect's footsteps had faded, swallowed by the tangle of service corridors and the hum of machinery in the distance. Ranger slowed his pace, nose working in tight arcs along the cracked pavement, until his head suddenly lifted. His ears pricked forward, body tense. Daniel followed his gaze to a dull beige side door tucked into the shadow of a loading bay. Above it, a faded employees-only sign sagged on rusted screws. The handle was scuffed, streaked with a darker smudge, oil from hands that had gripped it too many times. Ranger stepped closer, pressing his nose along the seam where the metal met the frame. His breath came in short, deliberate bursts. He looked back at Daniel, tail held low but rigid, a silent confirmation. Daniel rested one hand on the door, feeling the faint tremor of air from inside. It was cooler here, the temperature dropping a few degrees the moment he leaned in. A faint smell seeped through, a mix of motor oil, damp cardboard, and the stale tang of industrial cleaner, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten corners of warehouses and back rooms. He glanced over his shoulder, checking the alley. No one. The sounds of the parking lot were muted now, distant, just the hum of a nearby vent fan and the slow drip of water from a rusted pipe overhead. "All right, boy," Daniel murmured, voice low. "We're going in." The handle gave a reluctant squeak as he turned it. The door didn't swing easily. It scraped the concrete with a dull groan, the noise loud in the stillness. Ranger slipped inside first, his paws soundless on the worn linoleum. The hallway beyond was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent tube. Its light barely reached the far end, where the corridor turned sharply out of sight. Shadows clung to the walls, broken only by the pale rectangles of step. Kept his hand near his holster, his other brushing the radio clipped to his vest. He didn't like the silence here. No chatter, no footsteps, no sign of life beyond their own. It was the kind of quiet that felt intentional, like a space designed to hide what it contained. Halfway down the hall, a door on the right stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness inside. Ranger paused at it, sniffing, but after a moment he moved on. Whatever had passed this way hadn't lingered there. The farther they went, the more Daniel noticed the subtle signs of use, a fresh scuff on the wall where something had been dragged, a faint trail of dust disturbed in a single narrow line. He filed each detail away. As they reached the corner, Ranger stopped again. He pressed his nose to a thin strip of light leaking from beneath another door. His ears angled forward, catching something Daniel couldn't. Soft, muffled movement, maybe fabric shifting or a breath too quick to be casual. Daniel's pulse kicked up. The employees-only hallway had just stopped being empty. The instant Daniel rounded the corner, the world seemed to narrow to a single, sharp image. At the far end of the hallway, no more than 40 feet away, a man in a dark hoodie had a small figure clutched under one arm. Noah's sneakers scraped the floor as he twisted and kicked, a muffled whimper caught in the cloth pressed against his mouth. The man's free hand gripped the child's wrist in a way that was more restraint than guidance, dragging him toward the faint rectangle of daylight that marked an exit door. Daniel's breath locked in his chest for half a second. Then Ranger moved. It wasn't a hesitant advance or a cautious approach. It was a surge, a raw, controlled burst of motion that transformed the air between them into nothing. His nails clicked against the linoleum in a staccato rhythm that built with each stride, his shoulders low, ears pinned, tail straight like an arrow. Every fiber of his body spoke one word: stop. Police! Daniel's voice carried down the corridor, steady and hard. Let him go. The man flinched but didn't turn. He tightened his grip on Noah and lunged for the door. The child's head twisted, and Daniel caught a glimpse of wide, tear-bright eyes. Fear and hope tangled in the same look. Ranger! Daniel's command was sharp, clear. The dog responded instantly. Ranger's jaws locked on the padded sleeve of his hoodie. The suspect stumbled, one hand flying out to brace against the wall. Noah fell sideways, freed from the man's grip, hitting the floor on his hands and knees. Daniel was already closing the last few yards, his voice cutting through the scuffle. Stay down, hands where I can see them. The man struggled, twisting, trying to shake Ranger off, but the dog held firm, his weight anchored, growl low and vibrating against the fabric. The sound was primal, the kind that rooted a person in place as much as teeth ever could. Daniel reached Noah first, crouching to pull the boy into the corner by the wall. You're okay, buddy. I've got you. You're safe now. His words came quick but calm, his hand steady on the child's shoulder. Noah's breathing was ragged, but he clung to Daniel's arm with a grip that spoke more than words. Ranger shifted his stance, tightening his hold just enough to keep the suspect pinned without injury. Daniel stepped in, hand on the dog's harness, and gave the release command. Ranger obeyed instantly, stepping back but keeping himself between the man and the boy, his gaze locked like a sentry. The suspect froze, chest heaving, hands slowly rising. Daniel cuffed him against the wall, his movements efficient, practiced. The hallway was suddenly full of sound again. Ranger's steady breathing, Noah's quiet sobs, the distant thud of footsteps as backup moved in from the other end. You're done, Daniel told the man, his voice low but edged with steel. It's over. Outside, sunlight cut sharp angles across the loading dock as the exit door swung open under the weight of an approaching officer. But in here, in the dim, dust-scented hallway, it was the quiet presence of a German shepherd sitting just inches from Noah that made the space feel safe again. Daniel's radio crackled with incoming chatter, but for the moment, he tuned it out. He looked down at the boy, then at Ranger, and let the relief wash through him in a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The hallway still hummed with the aftershock of motion when the man suddenly wrenched himself free, not from Ranger's grip, but from the idea of capture itself. He shoved hard against the wall, a burst of desperate strength, and dropped his hold on Noah like discarding weight. The boy stumbled forward, knees buckling. You're safe now. I've got you. Ranger stayed at their flank, his gaze fixed on the back door the suspect had fled through, body taut, waiting for Daniel's cue. Daniel slid one arm under Noah's knees, the other cradling his back, and lifted him with a gentleness that felt almost ceremonial. The boy was light, too light, his small frame rigid with fear. Daniel could feel the quick thrum of his heartbeat against his chest. You're all right, buddy. You're with me now. Noah's fingers found the fabric of Daniel's shirt and clung there, twisting into the cotton like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. The faint scent of playground sand and sweat still clung to him, along with the acrid whiff of whatever chemical had been on that cloth pressed to his face. Daniel stepped back toward the wall, putting solid brick between them and any threat, even as his ears tracked the echo of retreating footsteps beyond the exit. Through his radio, he heard the dispatcher's calm but urgent tone. Units converging on West Loading Dock, suspect fleeing on foot. The sound was distant to him now, muffled under the weight of the boy's uneven breathing. Ranger shifted forward, sniffing at Noah's shoes, then gently pressing his head against Daniel's leg. The motion drew Noah's gaze downward, his wide eyes catching on the shepherd's steady presence. For a fleeting moment, something in his face eased, not relief exactly, but recognition of safety. Daniel lowered himself to one knee, letting Noah sit upright in his lap. "Can you hear me okay?" he asked, brushing a stray curl from the boy's forehead. Noah nodded once, slow, his throat working around words that wouldn't come. His lips moved silently, and Daniel recognized the shape of a name, maybe Mom or Dad, before it vanished. "It's all right," Daniel assured him again. "We'll get you back to them soon." Bootsteps thundered from the far end of the corridor, 2 uniforms, weapons ready, scanning as they approached. Daniel raised a hand to signal all clear. "He's gone out the back," Daniel said, voice shifting to command mode. "Kid's safe. He's breathing fine. No visible injuries. But call EMS to check for inhalants, possible chloroform exposure." One officer peeled away to relay orders into his radio, while the other crouched near Ranger, his gaze constantly sweeping for threats. The soft pad of his paws on the linoleum was the quiet counterpoint to Daniel's boots. When they reached the doorway that opened to the mall's service lot, paramedics were already jogging toward them, a stretcher in tow, though clearly not needed for transport. Daniel lowered Noah to sit on the back bumper of the ambulance, his own hand never leaving the boy's shoulder. A medic knelt in front of Noah, speaking softly, asking if he could breathe deeply, if he felt dizzy, if his throat hurt. The boy's voice was a whisper, but he answered, just enough for Daniel to feel a wave of relief crest in his chest. Behind them, an officer's voice crackled over the comms. "Suspect headed toward railroad tracks west of the property. Units in pursuit." Daniel didn't turn to look. That fight would continue without him for now. His fight, his responsibility, was sitting right here, small and silent and alive. The medic handed Daniel a small blanket, and he wrapped it around Noah's shoulders, tucking the edges in like sealing away the last of the cold from that dim hallway. "You're safe now," he said again, not because the boy needed to hear it once more, but because Daniel needed to say it, needed to believe it. Ranger sat at Noah's feet, head slightly tilted, amber eyes fixed on the child's face with that uncanny, unblinking patience only dogs seem to have. Slowly, Noah's hand slipped from the blanket and rested against the top of Ranger's head. The shepherd didn't move, didn't even blink, just stayed there, a silent anchor in the swirl of sirens and radio chatter. In that moment, with sunlight falling across the boy's small shoulders and Ranger's steady form beside him, Daniel felt the knot in his chest loosen. They had him back, and that was everything. The suspect's sedan sat at the edge of the service lot like it had been abandoned in a hurry, angled halfway across 2 parking spaces. The driver's side door hung just barely ajar, its frame vibrating with the faint echo of the earlier slam. Heat shimmered above the dark paint, distorting the reflections of flashing patrol lights. Daniel approached with caution, his gloved hand resting lightly on the doorframe before pulling it open the rest of the way. A bundle of zip ties and an unopened bottle of water with condensation still clinging to the plastic. Beneath these, wrapped in a worn flannel shirt, was a thick envelope. He set the other items aside and opened the envelope. Inside were printed sheets, dozens of them, each bearing an address, a set of initials, and sometimes a date scrawled in the margin. Some addresses had a red check mark next to them, others were circled in blue pen. Daniel's breath slowed. This wasn't random. This was a list, a ledger. On the passenger seat, a folded county map lay wedged under the seatbelt. He pulled it free, letting it unfold across the roof of the car. Thin black circles marked locations scattered across the county: a school playground in Oak Ridge, a rural park Daniel had patrolled years ago, the downtown bus terminal, all familiar places, all places where children gathered. The circles weren't neat. They had been drawn fast, maybe in low light, but they were deliberate. A handful of them matched the addresses in the envelope exactly. Behind him, Sophie's voice cut through the low hum of the lot. "What have you got?" Daniel glanced over his shoulder. She was approaching at a jog, hair pulled back tight, notepad in hand. Without answering, he gestured her closer and tapped the map. "These are our sites," he said quietly. "And this He held up the envelope. Is a record, not just of where he's been, but maybe where he planned to go. Sophie's eyes flicked over the page, her lips tightening. Some of these are, Daniel, this one. She tapped the top sheet. This is the address from that cold case I told you about. The girl at the park 3 years ago. Daniel's jaw set. The thread was weaving itself into something darker, older, and far bigger than just today's chase. Ranger nosed at the back seat again, pawing lightly at a crumpled fast food bag wedged under the driver's seat. Daniel reached in, pulling it free. Hidden beneath the trash was a small spiral notebook, its cover worn, pages thick with indentations from heavy-handed writing. He flipped it open. No full sentences, just strings of letters, numbers and symbols, dates without years, initials, the occasional crude sketch of a street layout. Every detail felt like a drop inside hadn't finished giving up its secrets. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Ranger stepped up, front paws on the edge of the seat, and sniffed deep at the floor mat. Then he looked back at Daniel, ears forward, gaze steady. Daniel reached down, lifted the mat, and found a flash drive taped to the underside. "Well, that explains it," Daniel murmured, peeling it free. The casing was scuffed but intact. Whatever was on here could be anything. Photos, messages, plans. Evidence they'd need to lock this man away for more than a single abduction attempt. He slipped it into an evidence bag just as Sophie returned. "Dispatch is moving units to the nearest 3 addresses," she reported. "We've got eyes on the rest within the hour." Daniel nodded, folding the county map carefully and sliding it into another bag. "Good, because if this map is what I think it is, we've only got a narrow window before the next red circle turns into another missing kid poster." The late afternoon sun had shifted, throwing longer shadows across the lot. Somewhere beyond the rows of patrol cars and flashing lights, the suspect was still running. But now Daniel knew this wasn't just about catching him. It was about dismantling everything he was a part of. Ranger stayed close at his side as he closed the sedan's door and stepped back. The shepherd's eyes followed every movement of the evidence techs as they moved in, like he understood the gravity of what they were touching. Daniel's hand found the back of Ranger's neck, steady and firm. "We've got the trail, partner," he said quietly. "Now we follow it." The conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and copier toner, the kind of scent that seeped into the air after too many long nights and not enough fresh air. The blinds were half closed against the late afternoon sun, striping the table with alternating bands of light and shadow. Spread across the surface was a patchwork of paper and possibility. Daniel's stack of printed addresses from the duffel bag, Sophie's case files from years past, the folded county map with its hasty black circles. The chaos was deceptive. Every sheet was a fragment of a larger shape, and that shape was starting to take form. Daniel sat at the head of the table, leaning forward, elbows planted. Sophie stood at his left, hands braced against the wood, scanning each document with the focus of someone who refused to miss a single detail. "Start with the overlaps," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. Sophie nodded, dragging a red marker across the table to herself. "All right, Hawthorne Park, circled in black on your map." She tapped a sheet from her own folder. "It's also in Caleb Vance's list, marked with the initials SR, Maplewood Mall." Sophie pulled another file from her stack, flipping it open with a practiced motion. 2 separate reports of attempted luring incidents, different descriptions for the suspect's vehicle, but the times were almost identical. Both happened on Saturday afternoons between 4 and 5 p.m. Daniel's pen tapped against the table, once, twice, before circling the mall's location. "That's a pattern. Same time, same day, different weeks." Ranger lay at Daniel's feet, head resting on his paws, but his ears were pricked forward, tracking the quiet tension in the room. Every so often his tail gave a slow, deliberate thump against the floor, like he understood the stakes but knew his moment hadn't arrived yet. Then Sophie slid a photo from one of her cold case files into the mix. It was an old, slightly grainy shot of a neighborhood playground. Sun-faded swings, a half-empty sandbox, the bright red frame of a jungle gym standing in the background. Ranger's head came up instantly. His nostrils flared and his ears went fully forward. He rose, padded toward the table, and pressed his nose to the photo. Daniel glanced down at him. "What is it, boy?" Ranger sniffed again, then looked up at Daniel with that same steady, unblinking stare he used when he'd found the flash drive in the suspect's car. Sophie's brows drew together. "That's the playground from the Greenwood case. 3 years ago, a girl named Chloe disappeared while her grandmother was on the bench 20 feet away." Daniel leaned closer to the photo. "Why is he reacting to it now?" Sophie shook her head slightly. "Maybe he's picking up a scent from the paper?" Daniel thought about it. "No, this paper's been in evidence storage, sealed." He studied Ranger for a moment, then the photograph again. "It's not scent, it's recognition. He's seen this place recently." Sophie frowned. "You think it's on the current list?" Daniel flipped through the addresses from the duffel bag, scanning quickly. There it was, Greenwood Park, Lot C entrance. No date, just a set of initials, CM. "Here," Daniel said, sliding the list toward Sophie. "It's still active, no checkmark, no strike-through." Sophie's gaze darted between the list and the old case file. If it's still active, then whoever's running this operation is revisiting like a hunting ground. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "This isn't opportunistic, it's structured. Someone's assigning locations, tracking them, marking progress." Sophie closed the last file, her expression grim. "And Caleb's just one cog in the machine." Daniel reached down, running his fingers briefly over Ranger's head. "Whatever's in that photo, whatever he's remembering, it's our thread. We pull it hard enough, maybe the whole thing unravels." Ranger leaned lightly into Daniel's hand, his body tense but steady. Daniel glanced back at Sophie. "We'll need to put Greenwood under watch. Discreetly. If they're planning to hit it again, I want to be there first." Sophie nodded, already jotting the assignment in her notebook. "I'll loop in Captain Morris. We'll set a rotation." Daniel's gaze swept the table one more time, taking in the lines of red ink, the scattered photos, the envelope of addresses. They'd connected enough dots to see the picture forming, and it wasn't just ugly. It was dangerous, alive. And now, thanks to one police dog's quiet insistence, they knew exactly where to press next. The ripple started small, a 30-second local news segment just before the evening weather report. A missing child found, a police dog credited with the recovery, and a suspect now in custody. But by the next morning, it had swelled into something else entirely. Parents were holding their children differently at the bus stop, not just by the hand, but with an extra squeeze, an unspoken, "I'm not letting go." You could see it in the way mothers bent to eye level before the school doors opened, in the way fathers lingered in their cars long after their kids disappeared inside, watching until the last possible moment. In the grocery store, neighbors stopped mid-aisle to exchange low, worried voices. Rumors bloomed fast. Someone said there was more than one suspect. Someone else claimed it was tied to the string of disappearances years ago. Most of it was half-truth at best, but fear has a way of filling in the blanks with whatever makes the world feel most dangerous. The local paper ran the headline in thick black type: "Police dog foils abduction attempt at mall." Below it, a grainy photo of Ranger, his ears forward, mouth slightly open as if mid-breath, standing beside Daniel. The caption called him a hero. By noon, rocking infants. Others keeping restless toddlers occupied with juice boxes. Grandparents clutched photographs of their grandkids, as if a picture could be an anchor in a storm. The air was warm, close, and laced with the faint scent of strong coffee from the back table. On the stage, the mayor stood at the podium, a crease between his brows. "We want to assure every family here, we are working closely with law enforcement to ensure the safety of our children." There was a murmur of agreement from the front rows, but further back someone called out, That's what you said 3 years ago." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The police chief stepped forward, taking the microphone. His voice was steady, but Daniel, standing off to the side with Ranger, could see the strain in his eyes. "We're not here to give empty promises. We're here to put measures in place that will make a difference." He outlined plans for increased patrols near schools and parks, a volunteer-led neighborhood watch program, and a direct hotline for suspicious activity. Every proposal was met with nods, but also with questions. So many questions. Why wasn't there a patrol at the playground yesterday? How many other kids have been targeted without us knowing? Is there more than one person involved? The chief gave careful answers, never confirming more than he could, never denying the possibility of a bigger network. Daniel could feel the shift in the room, a collective realization that what happened to Noah wasn't a single, isolated incident. Ranger lay at Daniel's feet, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the crowd with the same quiet alertness he carried in the field. Several kids pointed at him, whispering to their parents. One little girl, no more than 6, broke free from her mother's side and padded up to him. She stopped just out of reach, eyes wide, then whispered, "You saved him, didn't you?" Daniel crouched down beside her. "He helped," he said softly. The girl nodded solemnly, then retreated to her mother's arms. The exchange was small, almost invisible against the larger chaos, but it stayed with Daniel. Outside, the media presence grew. Cameramen clustered near the entrance, snapping shots of parents as they left the meeting. One reporter called out to Daniel, "Officer, is it true the suspect had a list?" refusing to be caught off guard again. For Daniel, it was both encouraging and sobering. People were paying attention now. That meant more eyes, more leads, but it also meant more pressure. If they slipped, if they missed even one step, the trust that was just beginning to regrow would vanish. And somewhere in the quiet edges of the county, someone who thought they could operate in shadows was realizing those shadows had just gotten smaller. Daniel glanced down at Ranger, who was watching him with calm, steady eyes. "Looks like we've got the town's attention, partner." Ranger's tail thumped once against the tile. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a community on high alert, a story that wouldn't fade quietly into the back pages. And the next move they made could decide whether it ended in resolution, or another headline no one wanted to read. The precinct was quiet now. The hum of fluorescent lights replaced the earlier chaos, and most desks sat empty, their chairs pushed in with the kind of finality that meant their owners wouldn't be back until morning. Outside the window, the last thin streaks of daylight faded into a cold indigo sky, the street lamps blinking to life one by one. Daniel sat at his desk, elbows braced on either side of the map still spread before him. The red circles and black pen marks looked more ominous in the dim light, like a blueprint of harm. Each address represented a place where it could have happened, or where it already had. He'd seen networks before, in the military, in gang cases, even in smuggling rings. But this was different. This was about children, about predators who had turned their patience into a weapon, who had blended into communities so seamlessly that even neighbors might never have guessed. The thought burned in his chest like a live coal. Ranger lay stretched out beside his chair, head on his paws, the picture of rest to anyone who didn't know better. But Daniel had worked with him long enough to see the subtler signs, the slow sweep of an ear toward the hallway, the faint twitch in his tail at the creak of the front door. Even now, the dog's instincts were wired for vigilance. Daniel leaned down, resting a hand on the broad curve of Ranger's shoulder. The fur was warm under his palm, grounding him. "We're not done," he murmured. "Not even close." It wasn't the giving them that comfort. The memory of Noah's small hands clutching his jacket in the mall hallway flashed across his mind. The boy's wide, stunned eyes, the tremor in his voice when he'd finally said, "I want my mom." Those seconds had carved themselves into Daniel's memory with surgical precision. And Noah had been lucky. Found in time. Brought home. But Daniel knew too well what it looked like when a child wasn't found in time. He'd been on those calls. He'd stood in those living rooms where the air was thick with grief, where the only sound was the rasp of someone trying to breathe through a sob that wouldn't end. He swore then, silently but with the weight of iron, that this would not be another one of those cases. From somewhere deeper in the building, a chair scraped across tile. A janitor's cart rattled softly past the bullpen. Ranger's ears pricked and then settled again, satisfied there was no threat. Daniel straightened, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. His body felt heavy, but the heaviness wasn't exhaustion. It was resolve setting in like concrete. He reached for the stack of files Sophie had left on his desk before heading home. Witness interviews, partial license plate numbers, inconsistencies in the suspect's statements. Every scrap mattered. Somewhere in this mess was a link, a name, a location that would crack the rest open. He flipped the first folder open, pen in hand, and started making notes in the margins. Ranger shifted, resting his chin against Daniel's boot. It was a quiet, wordless reminder. I'm here. We do this together. Daniel glanced down at him. Are you ready for what's next? The tail thump was slow but certain. It wasn't a ceremony. There was no applause, no dramatic music. Just a man, a dog, and the cold knowledge that the fight was far from over. But there was also something else, something steadier than fear or rage. Commitment. They would follow the trail until it ended, no matter how long it took, no matter how far it went. And somewhere in the darkness, Daniel hoped the people who thought they could prey on the vulnerable could feel that commitment closing in on them. The morning after the operation broke wide open, the precinct smelled nothing like it usually did. Instead of stale coffee and photocopier toner, the air was laced with the scent of cinnamon, fresh bread, and something sweet, maybe lemon bars. It started with one family, arriving just after roll call. A mother and father, holding the hands of a little girl who clutched a worn teddy bear, stepped through the double glass doors with a foil-covered tray in their arms. They weren't even halfway to the front desk before the mother's eyes brimmed with tears. "Are you Officer Daniel?" she asked, her voice wavering. Daniel, caught off guard, rose from his chair. "Yes, ma'am." The father set the tray on the counter, still warm, the smell of baked apple rising as the foil lifted, and extended a hand. "You brought our Emily home," he said simply. "We didn't know how else to say thank you." Ranger had been lying quietly beside Daniel's desk, but the moment Emily spotted him, she let go of her mother's hand and dropped to her knees. The German shepherd moved toward her with a slow, gentle step, lowering his head until his nose was level with the small stuffed bear. Emily pressed the toy to his muzzle like she was introducing him to a friend. By mid-morning, the trickle had turned into a steady stream. A stack of thank you cards grew at the front desk, many written in the shaky print of children just learning to write. One card had the word thank written backward, the crayon letters so heavy they dented the paper. Another had a crude drawing of Ranger with ears too big and a tail like a broom, but the smile was unmistakable. Baskets of muffins, jars of homemade jam, and bouquets wrapped in brown paper lined the wall beneath the K9 unit plaque. Officers coming off shift paused to grab a cookie or pour coffee, each one taking a moment to shake Daniel's hand or crouch to scratch behind Ranger's ears. In the middle of the bustle, a boy named Noah, the same boy they'd pulled from the mall hallway, arrived with his parents. He'd traded the fear-stricken face Daniel remembered for one lit up with shy excitement. Clutched in his small hands was a sheet of printer paper covered in marker scribbles. At the top, in blocky letters, it read, "Best dog ever." Noah crouched beside Ranger and without hesitation wrapped both arms around the dog's neck. Ranger stood perfectly still, tail swishing once, then twice. Daniel watched the boy bury his face into fur, his small shoulders rising and falling in a silent rhythm that looked like relief. Sophie appeared in the doorway holding a bouquet of sunflowers someone had just delivered. She gave Daniel a small smile. "You realize we're going to need another evidence room, just for baked goods and flowers." Daniel chuckled, but his gaze drifted back to the families, to the way parents kept a hand on their child's shoulder, as if the very act of letting go felt too risky now. To the way children who'd been quiet at first would, after a minute with Ranger, start talking, sometimes about school, sometimes about their pets, sometimes about nothing at all. It wasn't just gratitude, it was the human instinct to circle back. Small town festival. The light through the windows caught on the ribbons around flower stems, and the air had grown thick with the mingling scents of gratitude, sugar, spice, and blossoms. Daniel stood beside Ranger, taking it all in. There would still be long days ahead. The network wasn't finished, the work wasn't over. But this was proof that the fight mattered. He reached down, brushing his fingers over the thick fur at the base of Ranger's neck. "Looks like you've got a lot of fans, partner." Ranger glanced up at him, ears forward, as if to say, "And we've got a lot to protect." And Daniel knew, more than ever, that they would. The day's noise had faded into a hush. The last of the families had gone home, the precinct's front doors locked for the night. Through the glass, only a few desk lamps still burned inside, casting warm pools of light over scattered reports and coffee mugs left half full. Outside, the evening air was cooling, the kind that carries the scent of asphalt still holding on to the day's heat. Daniel sat on the concrete steps of the precinct, elbows resting on his knees, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Beyond the parking lot, the horizon was painted in slow-moving bands of orange and violet, the kind of sunset that looked almost too perfect for a day like this. Somewhere in the distance, a lone siren wailed briefly before fading into silence. Ranger sat at Daniel's side, his body a warm, steady presence. At first, the dog's gaze tracked the movement of a moth circling the light above the precinct door. But when Daniel exhaled, a slow, heavy sound, Ranger shifted. Without a sound, he rested his head against Daniel's knee. Daniel didn't move right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if he could will it to give him answers. Today had been full of gratitude, faces smiling through tears, the weight of a community's thanks. But beneath it all, a shadow remained. For every Noah, Emily, and child who made it home, there were others. Kids whose names were still on lists. Kids whose photographs were still tacked to corkboards in the station's back office, fading at the edges. Kids who might be out there right now, waiting for someone to find them before it was too late. He took a sip of the coffee. It had gone cold, but the bitterness didn't. Leaves from the row of trees that lined the street. The sound was soft, almost like the whisper of something reminding him that stillness was temporary, that nightfall didn't mean the work stopped. He reached down, fingers brushing over the rough fur between Ranger's ears. "You ready to keep going?" he asked. Ranger didn't move, but his tail tapped once against the step. The sun dipped lower, the light thinning to that final moment before the streetlights would hum to life. Daniel watched it fade and felt the quiet resolve settle deeper inside him. Not the firestorm kind of determination that burns hot and fades fast, but the kind that roots itself in bone. The kind that carries you through long nights and colder mornings. Somewhere inside the precinct a phone rang, muffled then silenced. He didn't turn to look, not yet. For now he sat with the dog who had chased shadows into light, with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new leads, new risks, and maybe, if they were lucky, new names to cross off the list. He drained the last of the coffee and set the cup beside him. Above them, the moth finally left the light and disappeared into the dark. Daniel rose and Ranger stood with him in the same motion, as if they were one body. Together they turned toward the glass doors. The reflection staring back at him was tired but not beaten. They stepped inside, the night closing behind them, and somewhere deep down, Daniel knew, this was far from over. The precinct's lobby was nearly silent when they stepped back inside, the soft buzz of the overhead lights the only constant sound. A couple of night shift officers glanced up from their desks, nodding at Daniel and Ranger as they passed. The day's chaos had thinned into that late-hour lull, when the building seemed to hold its breath before the next call. Daniel was halfway to his office when the radio on the wall crackled to life. The voice was tinny but urgent, cutting through the stillness. "Unit 12, we've got a hit. Name just came through in connection to those addresses on your map. Possible match to one of the initials. Subject, Warren Keats. Repeat, Warren Keats." Daniel stopped mid-step. The name landed in his mind like a dropped stone into water, ripples spreading instantly. He knew the name, not personally but from somewhere in the background noise of old case files, from the footnotes in reports Sophie had every deployment. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth, though it carried no lightness. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged the road ahead, no matter how rough. "Ready, partner?" he asked quietly. Ranger's response was instant, a single thump of the tail against the tile, followed by that subtle lean toward the door, his body already angling toward the night outside. Daniel turned away from his office completely, crossing the lobby with measured steps. His boots echoed faintly in the quiet, the sound in rhythm with Ranger's nails clicking beside him. Somewhere deep in his chest, the familiar mix of anticipation and resolve tightened. Outside, the air had cooled even more since sunset. The parking lot lamps cast overlapping cones of pale light, and the shadows between them felt darker than they should have. Daniel walked straight toward the patrol car, the cruiser's black and white paint catching the glow in sharp edges. He pulled open the driver's side door, the creak of hinges breaking the silence. Ranger, without needing a cue, circled to the passenger side, where his own door had been left unlocked. The dog hopped in with practiced ease, settling into the seat as if the car itself was part of his second skin. Daniel slid behind the wheel, the leather still holding a trace of warmth from earlier. He rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before turning the key. The engine rumbled to life, low and steady, like the pulse of something waking up. As the dashboard lights flared, Daniel reached for the radio, his voice calm but sure. "Dispatch, Unit 12 en route on the Keats lead." Static hissed, followed by the dispatcher's reply. "Copy that, Unit 12. Proceed with caution. Additional units will be monitoring your channel." Daniel set the cruiser in gear, the tires crunching softly over the lot's gravel edge as they rolled toward the main road. He didn't need to look at Ranger to know the dog's eyes were scanning the dark. They always were. Streetlights streaked across the windshield in intervals, each one marking the passing of seconds they couldn't afford to waste. Daniel kept his gaze on the road, but in his mind, the map unfolded again, the circles, the initials, the threads tying everything together. This wasn't just another address. This could be the first name they pulled from the shadows into the open. Beside him, Ranger felt like a pact. They drove on, the night stretching before them, the city's edges blurring into the kind of quiet where anything could be waiting. And in that quiet, Daniel knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the road. It was the next step. Sometimes, stories like this remind us why dogs aren't just pets, they're family. A German shepherd's loyalty doesn't fade when the day is done. It's there in the quiet moments, the watchful eyes, and the unspoken promise to protect the people they love. They ask for so little, yet give us so much. Trust, companionship, and a bond that time or distance can't break. If you're lucky enough to share your life with a dog, you already know how those small moments, a head resting on your knee, a gentle tail wag when you walk through the door, can fill your heart. I've come across a resource that's been meaningful to many dog owners I know. Something that helps strengthen that connection and deepen the understanding between you and your four-legged friend. I'm happy to share it if you'd like. No pressure, just something I personally believe in. Because at the end of the day, the greatest gift we can give our dogs is the same one they give us: our time, our patience, and our hearts.